When thinking about trauma and integration, and even the title of Dr. Bryant-Davis's lecture, The Biblical Narratives of Trauma, it seems like, whether fortunately, unfortunately, the Bible is filled with traumatic stories, both from the eyes of the perpetrator as well as from the eyes of the survivor. You can think of Judah raping his sister Tamar in 2 Samuel, David arranging the murder of Uriah the Hittite, God commanding the nation of Israel to perform multiple acts of genocide, or the Levite's concubine in Judges 19, who was raped, murdered, and cut into pieces and sent throughout the nation of Israel. The Bible's filled with traumatic, awful stories happening because our world is full of awful, traumatic things happening. It's not that our current world's going to hell in a handbasket or that kids these days are ruining the world. The truth is, there really is nothing new under the sun. And ever since the fall, the world has been a terrible, broken place where horrific things happen because we are a broken and fallen people. The fact that the Bible reflects this truth should give us some measure of comfort in knowing that God is still at work in these things, but also can complicate things and makes for the need for some very careful exegesis at times. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to go to Guatemala with a group from Fuller. And while I was there, I experienced some of the culturally aware, trauma-informed, spiritually integrated interventions that Dr. Bryant-Davis discussed earlier in her lecture. In Guatemala, I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Laura Botts, who was a psychologist practicing in that country, and she told us this story. Quick background info. For those of you who may not know, Guatemala was involved in what the government has called a civil war, but was more accurately a genocide designed to eradicate indigenous people groups from about 1960 all the way up until 1996. As a result, there's mass unmarked graves around the country in various places, as well as a widespread communal trauma that pretty much everyone shares there. So with that in mind, Dr. Botts told us this story about a man who was working in his field, tilling up the field, and in the process dug up a human skull. Didn't think too much of it. Oddly enough, things happen like that. So just continued without his day, but very quickly found himself experiencing some very clear traumatic symptoms. He couldn't sleep. When he did sleep, he was having nightmares. He wasn't eating, was crying, was afraid of going to the field where he found the skull, couldn't figure out why, feeling hypervigilant about things, very textbook things. So he decided to come to see Dr. Botts, which is a bit of a feat in itself, if you know anything about Latino culture and mental health, but great for her, great for him. So he comes to her, comes to Dr. Botts. She designs this intervention for him. Decides to have a communal lament funeral for this skull that he uncovered. Part of this communal funeral lament was a combination of both Maya and Catholic traditions. So in keeping with the Maya traditions, there's a 5-day mourning ritual with both Catholic interventions and Maya, or Catholic rituals and Maya rituals interspersed throughout those days. On the last day, there was a final Catholic mass funeral for this skull, and the priest, on Dr. Botts' behest, requested the community there that had all come together to symbolically place a name of someone they had lost in this armed conflict on this skull. It's pretty much everybody there, and when we were there, pretty much everybody you meet has lost multiple family members or have disappeared, don't know where they are, and it's very problematic for them. So this priest requested everybody symbolically place a name on this skull for someone that they've lost in the conflict. They end up burying the skull and have this communal mourning for these people. Very quickly after, the man reports a total relent in symptoms, and there's an overall growth and flourishing in the community as a result of this intervention. So this is one of the most profound, creative, honestly genius interventions that I've ever known. I've written some papers about it and did a poster at APA about it. So some of us may prickle a little bit about the idea of a syncretistic intervention, combining aspects of Maya and Catholic traditions. But we have to remember that both of these religions are so deeply ingrained in that culture that they're both religious as well as sociocultural factors that have to be considered if we're going to treat people in a holistic and total way. Part of our role as therapists, as clinicians, is to meet the client in the space where they are, and that includes making use of as much of their worldview as possible, regardless of how we think about it. So, like I said earlier, this past weekend, I was up in the mountains with quite a few junior high school students. On the last night, they have this big dance party. There's fog machines, strobe lights, loud music, all that fun stuff. So when we finish, I come back to our cabin, and there's a few of the guys in there telling me that, oh, so-and-so's crying outside. And so my first thought was, oh, who hit him, right? Somebody must have hit this kid because he's a bit of a difficult guy and can get on people's nerves pretty easily. So I go outside, and there's this 14-year-old boy sitting on the back stairs just weeping. And I'm not sure if you guys know the term ugly crying, but that's what he was doing. Not crying that you can, pull one of these and be like, all right, I can go, keep going my day. But the crying that can come from deep inside of you, that's loud, anguished. So I sit with him, put my arm around him, rub his back a little bit. And he ends up telling me that almost exactly a year ago, a family member actually died while hiking in the mountains right where we were staying. Yeah, right? I had no idea. And in fact, the very things that led to me thinking that he's a difficult kid were traumatic symptoms, like Dr. Bryant-Davis was talking about. He was forgetful, he wasn't sleeping, he wasn't eating. He had somatic complaints of stomach ache, headache, he was anxious, feeling dreadful. I thought he was just being difficult, As a trauma-informed person, I missed it completely. All these different symptoms, and he had all these different emotions going on. And he tells me how he's just so utterly alone and he can barely stand it. He tells me he feels he's lost his faith in God because he prays every night for God to make him feel better, but nothing ever happens. He just continues to feel pain and sadness constantly. I ask if you talked to your parents about it. He says he can't because his dad will call him up and they won't want to talk to him. So of course, I'm enraged towards his parents at the same time that I totally understand why he must be feeling so alone and lost. As we continue talking, he ends up saying something that I can't get out of my head. It's been rattling around the last few days. He's standing up and he's crying and he goes, I feel so many emotions and all of them are negative. And I had to I wanted to laugh, chuckle a little bit because when he said it, I can't think of a more accurate way to describe my own emotional process when I was his age. I don't know how to deal with it. Just feel bad, right? Experiencing such strong emotions when we're young can be incredibly difficult, especially if the skills needed in moderating those emotions have never been demonstrated to us. I say all this because one of the key pieces we need to consider during or after any trauma is the meaning-making process that occurs inside of that person. Specifically, we have to keep in mind how a person develops her theodicy. For those of you unfamiliar, theodicy is really how we conceptualize and grapple with who God is in the face of evil and suffering in the world. The development of a theodicy is really a process that looks similar to the theory-praxis cycle that most of you are probably familiar with. I think it's mostly in theology. I think it comes up everywhere, though, in a lot of different camps. So you see, because we use our understanding of God to make sense of the traumatic things that have happened to us. But we also use our traumas as a lens to make sense of who we think God is. Let me say it a different way. We have certain ideas about who God is that shape our meaning-making process of different traumas. So if I'm attacked in the street, I can say, oh, God's in charge. God must have a plan for me that involves me being attacked for some reason. Who knows? But at the same time, my experience of that traumatic event will shape my view about God so that I can say, oh, I was attacked in the streets. How can God really be totally in control if that happened to me? Like Dr. Bryant-Davis talked about those three aspects of who God is, right? So my view of God shapes how I view trauma, but my view and experience of trauma shapes how I view God in this cyclical process. So for my young friend this weekend, this family member died and has led to him feeling alienated and alone. So how can a loving and immanent God that intimately cares for him really exist? He may have thought contrarily beforehand, may have known that God loves and puts his arms around him, cares for him. But as a result of this new experience, his conceptualization of God begins to shift to the point that he now feels that there must not be a God because a loving God will not let that happen to him or his family. All of this matters because when working with someone who has experienced traumatic events, we have to take into account the significant ramifications through all aspects of their lives. We cannot lean on the crutch of God has a plan for this if that person has lost all faith in God because of what happened to her. At that point, the working through of how one conceptualizes God becomes another point of treatment. Maybe a point where we as clinicians need to follow our own advice and refer out to someone who might know more than us and can hold that question, and maybe just have the client speak to a pastor or clergy member that can more appropriately attend to those questions. Finally, the last thing I want to touch on is this idea, and I really struggle with how to word this, but like honoring trauma. Let me explain. So whether we're ministers, pastors, therapists, clinicians, in whatever capacity, just a friend sitting next to you, when someone trusts us enough to share their traumatic experience with you, that is a sacred and powerful thing. To have someone open up and let you into what is likely their deepest and darkest moments is a privilege that we must not take lightly. It doesn't make the stories or the pain any easier to listen to or to sit with. It doesn't mean we should push to rip out someone's trauma history in one session. But if that person decides to trust you and let you into that moment, we need to honor it as a sacred moment. In fact, if we push too hard or are too quick with it, we can hurt that person and leave them feeling too exposed too soon. When I first started seeing clients, my second year in the program, I had this guy come in for a first session. He was this big, tough guy, just out of prison, court ordered the therapy on probation. I was like, all right, this is my guy, right? I can deal with this. I know how to talk to these kinds of people. This is my kind of people. So we go into our session and he's telling me about bouncing around in different romantic relationships, things like that. I'm just kind of, life's not going so hot, doesn't really know why. And I remember just feeling like something else was going on. Something behind the scenes was a little hinky. So I kept pushing and digging, probing. And at some point he started to slow down. And I could tell he was starting to introspect. Starting to get close to something real. So I pushed again and asked him what was really going on for him. And I'll never forget his words. He says, I'm just so lonely, man. And starts to sob into his hands. And processed through it a bit. That was pretty close to the end of the session, so we didn't do that much with it, honestly. And I remember walking out of that room so damn smug. I made this big tough guy cry on the first session. Half an hour in, wasn't even hard for me, you know? And I went back to my shared office and I told my office mate, who's one of my close friends, about what happened. I was so proud of myself. And she very quickly goes, you better be careful. You might have gone too deep too quick. I was so indignant. I knew I was right. She was wrong. I was the world's best therapist and clinician, right? No one could tell me anything else. But let me tell you, I never saw him again. He never came back, no matter how many times I tried and reached out to him, tried to get in contact with him, tried to find him. I opened him up like a hack surgeon and then sloppily stitched it back together. But more concerned for my own pride than his well-being. I wasn't honoring his story or his pain. I was focused on edifying my own ego. And let me tell you, it's a mistake that I will hopefully never make again. Because people matter. Their stories matter. The person sitting across from you matters. And if or when they decide to open up to you about their pain and trauma, we have to be like Jesus and the bent over woman and see them for who they are, as a child of God. We cannot let their stories be erased the way these traumas try to, like Dr. Bryant-Davis says. We have to act like Jesus did and speak and figuratively touch this other person in a way that really shows that we are honoring them and their story. Thank you.